Look, I'm standing in my own driveway at 5:45 in the morning. The air is crisp. That blue-gray pre-dawn light is just starting to hit the pavement. And I'm holding a mug of black coffee that is the only thing keeping me upright after a late-night surveillance shift. When I hear the heavy, self-important crunch of boots on gravel, I turn around, expecting maybe a neighbor in Oppo's, S-Dog, or a confused delivery driver, but instead, I'm staring at two guys who look like they've been rejected from every police academy in the tri-state area, wearing these stiff polyester navy blue uniforms that still have the fold lines from the packaging, and they're marching toward me with a pair of plastic zip ties held out like they're about to take down a cartel kingpin. The bigger one, a kid who couldn't have been older than 22 with a patchy beard and a look of terrified bravado, clears his throat and tells me I'm under, HOA citizens arrest, for, repeated noncompliance and operating an unauthorized tactical vehicle in a residential zone, I just stood there. Honestly, I didn't even put my coffee down because for 15 years I've worked for the Bureau. I've spent a decade and a half chasing money launderers, staring down white-collar sociopaths, and navigating the darkest corners of federal financial fraud. And here I am, in my own quiet slice of suburbia, being threatened with Home Depot zip ties by two kids who probably still live in their parents' and Oppo's basements. It was the most surreal, pathetic, and dangerously stupid thing I'd ever seen. And as I felt the cold plastic of my real federal badge pressed against my hip in my pocket, I realized that these idiots and the woman who sent them had absolutely no idea whose morning they had just ruined. But before I tell you how this standoff ended with 3 squad cars and a federal indictment, let me take you back to how a quiet guy like me became public enemy number 1 in the eyes of the most corrupt neighborhood association in America. My name is Elias Vance, and when I moved into Cedar Hollow about 2 years ago, I thought I'd finally found a place where I could breathe. It's one of those picturesque 900-home developments where the lawns are a specific shade of emerald and the silence is so heavy you can hear a sprinkler head pop 2 streets over. And for the first 18 months, it was perfect. I kept to myself. I paid my $60 monthly dues on time, and I drove my modified Chevy Silverado, a beast of a truck, lifted with reinforced bumpers and tinted windows because when your job involves tracking human traffickers through backwoods terrain, you don't drive a Prius. It's my pride and joy, but it's also a tool of the trade, and for a year and a half, nobody cared, until the leadership at the HOA shifted and a woman named Meredith Thorne slithered into the presidency. Now, picture Meredith as the final boss of neighborhood Karens. She's got that sharp, asymmetrical bob that looks like it could cut glass, oversized designer sunglasses she wears even when it's raining, and she carries this silver iPad like it's a holy relic, snapping photos of every blade of grass that dares to grow a quarter-inch too high. But here's the kicker. Meredith didn't just want to, beautify, the neighborhood. She was a predator who smelled opportunity in a sleepy community, and within a month of taking office, she'd fired our old, boring management company and replaced them with, Thorne Residential Solutions, You don't have to be a federal investigator to see the red flag there. But most people just shrugged it off until the fines started hitting. It began with a $250 citation for my truck, claiming the vehicle height exceeded the community standard, visual profile, which was interesting because my neighbor 3 doors down has a Ford Raptor that's actually taller than mine, yet he didn't get a single orange notice on his windshield. When I tried to call the office to clear it up, I didn't in Oppo's. To get a receptionist, I got Meredith, and her voice sounded like a drill hitting a nerve as she told me that, Compliance is not a negotiation, Mr. Vance, and certain residents are being held to a higher standard of community aesthetics to ensure our property values Don and Oppo's suffer from a blue-collar atmosphere, I remember sitting there, staring at the phone, thinking about the irony of a woman who was literally embezzling from her neighbors talking to me about, standards, but I decided to play it cool. I'm a patient guy. I've waited out suspects for 12 hours in a freezing van, so I figured I'd just document it and move on. But Meredith wasn't in Oppo's. Looking for a quiet life. She was looking for an ATM, and as I started digging, just a little light late-night research into our HOA financial disclosures, I realized she had increased the, enforcement budget, by 800% in a single quarter. She had turned Cedar Hollow into a tiny police state, and she was the judge, jury, and executioner, funneling the fine money back in her own company under the guise of, administrative consulting, I started noticing patterns too. She was an oppos. T just hitting everyone. She was specifically targeting the people who questioned her, the elderly residents who couldn't fight back, and me. Especially me, after I stood up at a monthly meeting and asked why we were paying $4,000 a month for, security consultations, to a guy named Derek who just happened to be Meredith's brother-in-law. The room went dead silent that night. The hum of the fluorescent lights suddenly feeling like a roar, and Meredith just stared at me over the rim of her glasses with this look of pure, unadulterated venom. She didn't oppose. T answered the question. She just leaned into the microphone and said, Mr. Vance, your lack of respect for the board's authority is noted, and I'd suggest you spend more time fixing your overgrown flower beds and less time worrying about matters beyond your comprehension. That was the moment the war started, and about 3 days later, I found a lien notice on my front door for $1,200 in, accumulated intimidation fees, a charge she literally invented on the spot. That's when I stopped being a polite neighbor and started being a special agent. I spent the next 2 weeks running forensic audits on the HOA's tax filings, using every public record search at my disposal, and what I found was a masterpiece of amateur fraud. She was double billing for lawn care, kickbacking 20% of the security fees to her own offshore LLC, and using the neighborhood's reserve fund as her personal shopping account. I was building a case that would put her away for 5 to 10 years, but Meredith was getting desperate, and when she realized I was an oppos, T backing down, she decided to escalate the situation by creating the, Cedar Hollow Enforcement Task Force, which brings us back to those 2 idiots in my driveway with the zip ties. Back to 5:45 a.m., I'm looking at these 2 kids, Tyler and Brad, and I can see Tyler's hand shaking as he reaches for my arm. He tells me they have, emergency authorization, from the board to impound my truck and detain me until the sheriff's department arrives because I'm, posing a threat to community stability, I actually laughed a low, tired sound that seemed to rattle them more than a scream would have, and I told them, guys, I'm going to give you exactly 5 seconds to turn around, get back in that golf cart, and tell Meredith she's out of time, or this is going to become the worst day of your lives, Tyler, trying to be a tough guy, snaps the zip ties and says, we aren't an oppos. T taking orders from you, Vance. You're under arrest for HOA violation 402B, I didn't an oppos. T move an inch when he grabbed my shoulder, but the second he did, the game changed. I didn't an oppos. T reached for my gun. I didn't an oppos. T need to. I just reached into my back pocket, pulled out the black leather wallet, and flipped open the gold shield of the FBI. The look on their faces, honestly, I wish I had a high-def camera on them, because Tyler's jaw didn't an oppos. T just dropped. It looked like it was trying to leave his face. He went from, suburban commando, to, terrified child, in roughly 0.5 seconds, and as he saw the words Department of Justice and Special Agent glimmering in the early morning sun, he actually stepped back so fast he tripped over his own boots. You guys just attempted to unlawfully detain a federal officer while he was on active duty status, I said, my voice dropping into that calm, flat tone that always makes a spec start sweating. That's a felony. Impersonating a law enforcement officer while attempting to execute a fraudulent arrest, that's another 5 years. And conspiracy to commit civil rights violations under color of HOA law, we're looking at a decade, minimum, Brad started stammering that they were just, following Meredith and oppos, his orders, and that she told them they had the same power as the police, and right as he's about to cry, a real local sheriff's cruiser pulls into the cul-de-sac, mirrored. It had actually called them herself, thinking she was going to watch me get hauled away in handcuffs. She pulls up in her white SUV right behind the cruiser, hops out with her iPad ready to record the, justice, and she's got this smug, triumphant grin on her face as she walks toward the officer, pointing at me and yelling, Officer, that's him. That's the man who's been harassing our community. I want him removed from the premises immediately." End quote. The deputy, a guy I'd worked with on a joint task force about 6 months prior named Miller, looks at me, looks at the two kids in the fake uniforms with zip ties on the ground, and then looks at the federal badge in my hand. He doesn't oppose. He go for his handcuffs. He just sighs, rubs his temples, and says, end quote, "Meredith, tell me you didn't oppose. He just try to have her nephews arrest a federal agent for a parking ticket." End quote. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Meredith's grin didn't oppose. He just fade. It curdled, and she looked at me like she was seeing a ghost. I walked right up to her, not a single bit of anger left, just pure professional satisfaction, and I said, quote, "Meredith, the funny thing about being a financial crimes investigator is that I don't oppose. T just look at parking tickets. I look at bank statements. I look at your and oppos, residential solutions and oppos, offshore filings. I look at the $42,000 you moved out of the neighborhood pool fund last Tuesday." End quote. Her face went a shade of pale that I didn't oppose. T think was biologically possible, and she actually tried to turn around and get back in her car, but Miller wasn't oppose. T having it. He told her to stay put while he called his sergeant, and I just stood there, finishing my coffee, watching her little empire crumble in the light of a Tuesday morning. The fallout was spectacular. Within 48 hours, the FBI and the state attorney's office had served search warrants on Meredith's home and her business, and we found a mountain of evidence that made my initial digging look like child's play. She had stolen nearly $250,000 over 3 years, using a network of fake contractors and intimidation tactics to keep people quiet. She was an oppose. T just a mean neighbor. She was a career criminal who thought a gated community was a safe place to hide. Tyler and Brad ended up taking a plea deal for their, quote, enforcement, quote, activities, and Rick, her brother-in-law, lost his security license faster than you can say in oppose. Conflict of interest, and oppose. Meredith, though, she didn't oppose. To go down easy. Even as she was being led away in real handcuffs, she was screaming about how the neighborhood would, quote, route without her, quote, and how I was a, quote, traitor to the community, quote. It's been 6 months since then, and Cedar Hollow has never been better. The lawns are still green, the kids are back to playing in the streets, and we have a new board that actually understands that an HOA is supposed to serve the people, not rule them. My truck still sits in my driveway, a little taller and a little louder than the rest, and every time I see it, I'm reminded that some people think they can buy or bully their way into a position of absolute power, but they always forget that there's always someone somewhere who's been trained to bring that power down. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and the reason I'm telling you this. Meredith Thorne ISN and oppose, T an anomaly. There are thousands of these small-time tyrants running HOAs, school boards, and local councils across the country, using a tiny bit of authority to ruin lives and line their pockets. And most of the time, they get away with it because people are too busy or too scared to fight back. I had a badge and a background in federal law to protect me. But what about the family 3 streets over? What about the retiree who lost his life savings to, end quote, special assessments, end quote? He didn't oppose. T understand. Was I right to use my position to take her down so aggressively? Or did I become a bit of a, end quote, tyrant, end quote, myself in the process of seeking justice? Some of my neighbors still look at me with a bit of fear now, knowing I have the power to dig into their lives if I wanted to, and it makes me wonder if the cycle ever really ends. So, I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with a local power tripper who thought they were above the law? How far is too far when you're fighting for your home? Drop a comment below, because the more we talk about these, end quote, Meredith Thorne's, end quote, of the world, the harder it is for them to stay in the shadows. And honestly, I'm still deciding if I'm the hero of this story or just the bigger shark in the pond. What do you think?